Well, the Bank of England Governor Andrew Bailey will be in front of the House of Lords Economic Affairs Committee on Tuesday. One of the questions he will supposedly be asked, according to the House of Lords press office, is whether the IMF's assessment is right that advanced economies should be not worried about public debt and should take advantage of historically low borrowing costs to increase spending. Today we ask, should governments ever be worried about public debt, and try to get to grips with where money is really created. Spoiler alert, by and large, Andrew Bailey is not really producing any of it through quantitative easing. So what is QE really doing? All that and more on today's Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Welcome along. Well, so we need money right now. Businesses need access to it to survive. Those with a good idea, you might want it to try and get something new started, because obviously during a downturn is often the time to start a new company. And lots of people need it to stay away from food banks. Even those who are doing sort of okay need to be encouraged to spend. So more money in their pockets would be useful for that. But already Rishi Sunak, the UK Chancellor, and others like Josh Frydenberg in Australia are already talking about balancing the books, getting rid of this huge budget deficit that's been accrued this year. Now, we've talked, Steve, a lot about how budget deficits are not a bad thing. But what about the idea of money creation? We've talked about that as well, but I want to go a bit deeper on it today. Are governments really creating money? Because money can be created in two ways, can't it? It can be cash that's created by the Treasury, which is a rapidly diminishing proportion of all money. And then there are commercial banks issuing loans. But then also, people talk about quantitative easing as creating money. But is that right? Is it really, or is it's just liquidity for commercial banks, isn't it?
Well, this is where you've got to think in double entry bookkeeping terms. And this is something which I've learned myself by, first of all, trying to model money and working out how to do it back in the early 2000s, I think, mathematically model money creation. But then ultimately, I was using single entry as it happens. And I finally realized you've got to use double entry. And then banks themselves, all financial institutions model what they're doing using double entry bookkeeping. And then when you ask yourself any question like that, you've got to take a look at the books themselves and say, well, where are these operations occurring? So if you're going to, then the general principle that I've realized, again, from building Minsky and working with the godly tables that are an essential part of Minsky, is that if you're going to create money, you have to have an operation which occurs on both the assets and the liability stroke equity side of the banking sector's ledger. And once you've got that in your head, then you can say, well, does QE create money? And the answer is categorically no.
Let's go through it so we understand that. Let's go through it very quickly, step by step. Now, this might be old ground for some people, but just so we're all on the same page. So the government issues debt, issues bonds. They go onto the primary market, which are bought by a small number of banks, and they're using it from their excess reserves, basically sitting in their banks. So they say, well, okay, this money's doing nothing, so we're going to buy these bonds because at least we're going to get paid interest on that. So that happens. That's a fairly straightforward transaction in that the assets are now sitting with these banks. They've got the asset of the bonds, and the money that they paid for those bonds is now sitting where? Sitting with the government, I guess. So it's
well, if you have the government selling bonds to the private banks, and the banks get bonds in their hands effectively and lose money. Okay. Yeah. So when you look at where bond sales, where they are occurring, they are a transaction that occurs entirely on the asset side of the banking system ledger, and therefore they don't create money. Okay? Because what happens, and you've got to go take a step back, where did the banks get the money to buy the bonds with in the first place? And the answer to that is out of the government deficit itself, whether that's the actual deficit historically or it's an anticipated deficit in the sense that the government is issuing bonds to cover what they think is going to be the deficit over time, which is the usual sort of thing that happens. When I look at it using Minsky's continuous time modelling approach. If the government spends, then it's putting money in your bank account. Let's say it's buying audio services off Phil Dobbie. Then it puts money in your bank account. And to do that, it has to put money in the reserve account of the banking sector as well, which is on the asset side. And if it's putting £100 into your account and taking 50 out in tax, then that's a net 50 going into your account, which increases your assets, which that is your bank account, which is the liability of the bank you bank with. Its liability goes up, so does its asset, which is the reserves. So it's got 50 quid in additional reserves, and then the government comes along and issues 50 quid's worth of bonds to cover the gap between the two, and the bonds earn a 1 or 2% rate of interest, whereas the reserves earn a 0 or even a negative rate of interest, as some of the central banks are playing with these days. Playing is in terms of kids who don't know what they're damn well doing. But anyway, the government has created 50 quid of additional reserves. It then offers you 50 quid of bonds, giving a positive rate of interest. You say, I'll have those, thank you. You effectively use the reserves. It's been more complicated in terms of the actual internal mechanics inside the financial sector, but that's the money that's going to do it has been created by the deficit. So the sale of the bonds is just an asset swap. It doesn't create any money.
So when you then take that to the next stage where the central bank says, well, okay, we're going to buy those from the private banks, it's just more of the same. So
it's another asset swap.
Yeah.
So in that case, if you I'm just looking at one of the Minsky models I built of this whole thing, and as part of it, a couple of my Patreon supporters wanted to know what the hell happens when you have pensions being purchased. You know, if you have a pension firm that buys bonds, what does that do to the whole exercise? And this surprised me. I didn't expect the outcome. But if you have a company which say sells pensions to workers. So workers pay a fee every month to buy a pension, and then with that money, the pension fund buys bonds to cover it, and then pays the pension itself using the interest earnings on those bonds or the profit in buying and selling bonds and the trading that happens in the bond market. That you have a negative, and the pension fund is buying bonds, so it's got to use its own deposit account. So as the deposit account goes down, that's a liability of the banking sector. So the liabilities of the banking sector have contracted. Therefore, the assets also have to contract. So where do you take it out of? Well, they're taking it out of the bank's bonds. So you put a minus in the bank bonds. What that means is that a pension fund, when it buys bonds, is actually destroying money. Because the liabilities of the banking sector, liabilities plus equity of the banking sector, are fundamentally money. If you using that money to buy bonds, you're putting a negative on the liability side and a negative on the asset side of the banking sector. Where does the negative come from? It comes out of the bonds that the bank currently owns. So for that to actually happen, the banks have to make a profit. They're going to give you reserves at par because they're not paying any interest on reserves, or not earning interest on reserves. But if you're going to buy bonds, they're going to sell you at less than par to make a profit out of the transaction. But when they do it, the assets of the banking sector have fallen, the liabilities have fallen, you've actually destroyed money. So rather than these bond purchases by NBFIs creating money, they're actually destroying money.
Right. So when a central bank buys government bonds off commercial banks, then they are just expanding the excess reserves of those commercial banks.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So and nothing happens with that. Those excess reserves do nothing unless they go and buy more government bonds, of course.
Well, so, no. What you think within the question? This is what QE is doing. If you have and quantitative easing, of course, is not linked to the government deficit. So if you're looking at bonds being issued to cover the government deficit, the deficit itself creates the money. It creates the excess reserves. The excess reserves are used to buy the bonds.
Yeah.
That's all a self-contained operation. But if the bond buying itself doesn't create any money, it just converts cash into bonds, which is profitable for the banks, but it doesn't actually create any money. But if you're talking about QE, going the opposite direction, so the central bank buys bonds off the private banks, it'll do that in a way that makes a profit for the private banks, the price it pays. But that means that the bond holdings of the banks go down, the reserve holdings, which is effectively cash, go up.
Yeah.
And that then gives the banks want to have as much of their money in income earning form as they possibly can.
So do you want to have a guess what they do with it? Well, you're going to have to guess, because to hear the answer, you've got to listen to the full version of this podcast. And to do that, you've got to be a subscriber at debunkingeconomics.com or become a supporter of Steve Keen on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Prof Steve Keen. And if you donate $10 or more each month to his work, then you get access to this and all the other 200 or so podcasts in this series. We'll see you again next week. I'm Phil Dobbie. He's Steve Keen. Thanks for listening.